grieving. Some families will be lost to one another forever. To those of you who face the difficulties of reconnecting with family and establishing ongoing relationships, we say sorry. We offer this apology in the hope that it will assist your healing and in order to shine a light on a dark period of our nation's history. To those who have fought for the truth to be heard, we hear you now.
You're listening to Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption. I'm one of your hosts, Jo Sparrow. This podcast is a production of Jigsaw Queensland Post-Adoption Support Service. However, the views expressed are those of the people participating, not necessarily Jigsaw Queensland. The podcast discusses adult themes and listener discretion is advised. Hi everyone, I'm your host and president of Jigsaw Queensland, Jo Sparrow. Today's guest will be well known to many of you. Thomas Graham is a South African-born adoptee who migrated to Australia 25 years ago and in 2009 started the Australian Journal of Adoption, an online journal providing an independent, open access forum for people affected by or involved in adoption. He published 16 volumes focusing on the adoptee experience before hanging up his hat. After the Australian Adoption Journal, he published an adoption blog called Ipsify for 3 years, offering shorter and personalised interviews and commentary on adoption matters. He was also part of the grassroots adoptee groups that helped set the path for what is now known as Adoptee Rights Australia. In addition, Thomas once ran a Canberra-based adoption support group, sat on the government committee to oversee the implementation of some key recommendations in the Senate report into forced adoption, and then by his own account just disappeared and withdrew from any involvement in the adoption community. In preparation for today, Thomas noted that over 20 of my previous podcast guests have interacted with him in the past through the journal or other adoption-related activities. Welcome to Adopt Perspective, Thomas. I'm thrilled to finally have you on.
Yes, thank you, Jo. Thanks for the invitation, and it's good to be here. And my compliments to you and Jigsaw for delivering this podcast, because it is an important resource for people that are affected by adoption. So well done on producing it.
Thank you.
And I look.
Okay, can we start at the beginning? What was it like for you growing up as an adopted child in South Africa?
Well, I think just to provide some context for our discussion, I'll try and give a short snapshot of my first 30 years in about 3 minutes, if that's possible.
I've got the timer on, go.
So, I was born into the closed adoption era, where I was separated from my mother at birth and given a new identity and family, and my personal records were sealed. And the intention was that I would not know or meet my mother, my family, my father, or my first family. That was what the system was designed to do. And closed adoption was practiced in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, South Africa, Rhodesia, New Zealand, Canada, as well as here in Australia, as we know. So it really had this international footprint, particularly in Commonwealth countries. And so my start in life was not unlike many other closed adoption babies here in Australia. It was kind of traumatic and terrifying because my mother, my source of life, in all its preciousness and vitality, was taken from me. So this life source, whose heartbeat, whose voice, whose smell, whose body sensations I'd come to know in utero, were lost to me. Mm-hmm. And my mother was not allowed to hold or see me at birth, even though she worked as a nurse in the maternity hospital where I was born.
Oh, wow.
So, and for 10 days, I lay in sensory confusion, waiting in limbo to be allocated to a new family. So it was a cruel, uncertain, and unsettling start to life. And I know you will relate to this because in the beginning of your PhD thesis, which was a memoir about adopted wounds, you wrote, and I quote, "My life has two beginnings. The first was my birth, and the second was my adoption, an occasion which marked both a death and a rebirth." So that's how we started our lives. And I was taken into an English-speaking married family, mother, father. They had a biological daughter of their own. Now they practiced British customs and traditions. It was a Catholic household. And my adopted family were kind, loving, and generous people. In this lottery that we call adoption, I drew a good family. Deirdre, my adopted mother, was overly protective, ever close, but probably emotionally distant. Jack, my adopted father, was seldom close, as well as emotionally distant. But I was fortunate that I had a grandmother that lived with us. So Granny Hilda she and I, for some reason, bonded very well. And she was a pivotal factor in my life. And, whenever I think of her, I have this surge of positive energy. So I grew up in the suburbs in Johannesburg, which is not unlike suburbs in any of our Australian cities. I went to school, church on Sunday, played sport, had holidays, listened to the radio because we didn't have TV in those days. It was a middle-class upbringing in a stable home within a family setting. And I was told early on that I was adopted. But then the subject was taboo. It was never talked about. So like many adoptees, I grew up wondering who I was and where I fitted in. And over the years, as a child, I was determined to find my mother, even though I didn't even know her name. And you might ask, well, how could I be so certain about this? Well, a few years ago, an aunt who knew me as a young boy said to me, she once asked me when I was a child, because I always used to save my pocket money, why do you saving? What are you saving for? And my response was to find my mother.
Mm.
And so, from an early age, the impact of adoption was quite profound on me. And by nature, I'm introverted. I was thoughtful, I'm independent. I was kind of calm on the outside, but pretty stern on the inside. And so in some ways, I was this compliant, obedient, quiet boy. Although I was also rebellious and deviant, particularly when I was in my teenage years. And I learned early to keep my most precious thoughts and feelings to myself. And when it came to who I was, I was unsettled and confused. And when I think back on those first 30 years, adoption impacted all 9 major decisions or directions in life. And I'll just give you a few examples, in terms of relationships. Despite the love and acceptance I had as part of the family, when I got to my final 2 years of school, I asked to go to boarding school to get out of the house because I just didn't feel comfortable there. In my 20s and 30s, I was never confident in settling down, finding a partner, marrying, having a family. I found close attachments hard. And when I look at my education, history was always my strongest subject at school. When I went to uni, I studied archaeology and religious studies. My career, most of it in those days, was in museums. So there was this pattern of always looking back to the past and never really focusing on the present or the future. So at my core, I was always seeking a sense of belonging or of meaning. And until, I was 29 years of age, I never had met another adopted person. I thought I was one of a kind. So, those are, that characterizes, aspects of what I was, in the first half of my life, where, as I said, adoption impacted so many of my choices and decisions I've made.
Yeah. There's so much of that I identify with, Thomas, and particularly I was talking to somebody on the weekend. We're in a support group actually, and I was describing how I often felt like I was a puppet with this hand that was turning my head and my thoughts and my lens on life, I guess, in different directions through an adoption lens. And I didn't know that. I didn't understand. I knew something was, but I didn't know what it was. And I suspected it might be something to do with adoption, but we weren't given any information about how adoption might impact us when we were young. So we're really quite blind to what that puppet hand, I guess, was that was turning our lives around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because it wasn't talked about, and our parents weren't given any support or information, they were flying blind. And everyone worked on this assumption that being a clean slate and a substitute family, we would all live happily ever after. But it wasn't like that, know, and most other adoptees who are listening to this would also know.
Yeah.
That wasn't the case. So yeah, and then, I at about 29, I began my search to find my mother. So, and at the time, I mean, what the catalyst for that was that I was working in a regional museum at the time, and a woman by the name of Irma Simpson came into the museum and asked for a photograph of a house, which was a kind of an unusual request. And I asked her, why did she want it? And she said, I'm adopted. I'm looking for my mother. And she lived there, and that was the spark, literally, that ignited my search. And the following day, I mean, Irma Simpson was her name. She gave me a telephone number of an adoption agency in Johannesburg, and I called them, and that was way back in 1986, and I was given a name and an age of my mother and the place I was born in South Africa on a small piece of paper, and I had that. Yeah, today.
Yeah.
So it's one of my most prized possessions, because, I mean, as I think you and a lot of other adoptee people know, that, that first time that we're given the name of our mother, how significant and special that is.
Yeah.
And so thereafter, I started a search to find Dorothea. No, that was my mother's name always. And that took me 4 years. And I know we've got lots of other things to talk about, so I won't go into that long search. And other than to say, it predated the internet and search engines and social media platforms. It required good old-fashioned detective work. And
yeah, it was hard work back then.
Yeah, and with the help of Jenny, who was a dear friend, we found Dorothea in a small town in north of Hamburg in Germany. I mean, it was a very exciting and nerve-wracking experience, and done as it often is in secrecy, because I didn't want to impact on my adopted parents, which I think is a common thing. And then I was also unsure what I would find. Would my mother be alive? Was she dead? And if she was alive, would she welcome me? So after 4 years, yes, we found her, and she was very much alive, and she did want to see me. So finding her was this exhilarating experience, but meeting her was not so. And you might ask why. Well, I think over the decades, because it was decades, I developed this fantasy figure of mother, and meeting her was an anticlimax. It was a disappointment. And she was a mother. She was my mother, but yet a complete stranger to me. And all I saw was this elderly, grey-haired woman who didn't feel like mother at all, And I say that respectfully in terms of her age at the time. But fortunately, she came to South Africa to see me, and a year later I went to Germany to see her and the extended family. And I was also lucky because she was not only willing to meet, but she was also prepared to tell me the circumstances surrounding my conception and my father's name. And, on the question of my father, I never met him because he had died a few years prior to meeting Dorothea. But I do have 2 half siblings, a brother, half sister. And my half brother, that is the same father, different mothers, is 2 days older than me.
Oh.
2 days, which explains why Dorothea and I were left high and dry, because my father went off and married the other pregnant woman. So in the aftermath, and I think, when quite often, especially when they had many channels used to broadcast adoption reunions on television. They always had these idyllic gatherings and idyllic endings. Well, it didn't really work out that way for me. So in its aftermath, my life kind of fell apart. Right. So I was on this emotional high, having found my mother, met her and the extended family. And I really thought, I'd found myself. I'd for everything that I'd looked and searched for, I'd found, and I could now really be myself. So I thought I had to completely restart my life. So I resigned from my long-term secure job. I thought I could work as a consultant. I married for the first time, and at my wedding, I brought my 2 sets of parents together for the first time, which was a crazy thing to do in hindsight, because we were all so ill prepared. I sold my apartment I had, and I went out and sort of worked as a independent consultant. And then within a few years, it all collapsed, and I landed at rock bottom. I had no job, no partner because I had divorced, no home, and I wasn't clearly connected to my mother or my family. So I had to rebuild my life, and I made one of the best decisions ever. I migrated to Australia to start anew, and with Slabadanka, who's was my wife and new partner at the time, Louis, her son, and a mother-in-law. So, and 25 years later, I'm still with Slabadanka, and Louis still remains very much part of our family. So yeah, that sort of gives a basic synopsis of my birth in South Africa and my early life and finding out searching for Dorothea and finding her, and then post reunion everything falling in a heap, and then deciding to start anew in a new country, and I'm immensely pleased that I did.
Yeah. One of the things that you said, Thomas, I think so many adopted people fall into this trap of thinking we're going to find our mother and our biological families, and it's going to give us the answer to our identity. And then when we do meet them, we kind of realize actually it's a part of that puzzle, but it's not that answer. Like there's a whole lot of other work that has to happen to help with that. And I think, thank you so much for sharing that in particular, because I think that's something that a lot of us go in hoping,
Yeah, well, I think in those days we were ill prepared. I think there's much more information these days to prepare yourself better on both sides, and as I said, bringing my two sets of parents together on my wedding day, was a crazy thing to do.
Yeah. I've done plenty of those crazy things myself, Thomas.
So, and they got on well, but it just wasn't the right place at the time, to do it.
Well, you wouldn't have been settled on such an important day either, because I know whenever I've brought my families together, how I feel inside, and it's anything but calm.
Yeah, absolutely.
So not an ideal day to do that. Yeah. So given that you were born overseas, what was the catalyst for you becoming involved in the adoption community here in Australia, where you've been such an active participant for so many years?
Well, when we arrived in Australia, I mean, we started off in Wagga, where we spent 5 years, and I was in my 40s then, so my focus became, settling into a new country and sort of raising and supporting a family. So what many people, of my age would have done in their 30s and 40s, 20s and 30s, I was doing in my 40s. Yeah. And then Dorothea, she came and visited us here in 2005, and the visit didn't go particularly well. There was still a distance between her and me, which I couldn't really understand or resolve. And despite that encounter, I was still restless within myself, right? And it puzzled me, and I wanted to know why. And so I went to an adoption support group called Mosaic here in Canberra. It was run by Margaret Green, and she did it for years. And she was a late discovery adoptee. And there I was introduced to the Primal Wound, Nancy Berrier's seminal book on understanding the adopted child. And that was a revelation and a game changer for me, as you and other adoptees, I think, can attest. Because finally, there was someone who understood and could articulate what it meant to live in this complex emotional landscape of an adopted person. So, it validated our pain and gave us permission to have a voice and speak. And so something shifted, within me. Yes, I still had lots to learn and to work through, but reading The Primal Wound and the sequel, Coming Home to Self, The Adopted Child Grows Up, changed me, and in a big way. And the second book, the title of the second book, aptly describes what it felt like. We could come home to self, or to myself, within myself. And in a way that, it's the ultimate homecoming. So the Primal Wound, created this insatiable appetite to know more about adoption and my adoption king, because as I mentioned earlier, I'd never met another adopted person until I was over 30. And also to understand these psychological, emotional, and spiritual aspects of adoption. And by this stage, I'm approaching 50, so I'm bordering on old age.
Don't say that. So, I'm over 50.
Well, yeah, I know. It's, but it, at the time it felt, to get to 50 and you're still finding out who you are and what you are, which is symbolic of being adopted. So I'm not being ageist in any way, but just the knowledge of reaching half a century and you're still only scratching the surface about who or what you are.
Yeah.
And about this thing, adoption, that the system that had really handicapped me in so many ways. So I wanted to explore, and find out how adoption affected other people, so I could understand myself a bit better. And at that time, quality info and sources were hard to find in one place. So I started my own, which was Australian Journal of Adoption and AJA. And, serendipitously, around that time, Slavananka, my wife, worked at the National Library of Australia, and they were prepared to host a suite of online journals using what they called open journal systems. They were developed by Canadian universities. And the whole point of that was to make knowledge more accessible to everyone. So whatever the theme, or if someone wanted to create a journal, they had the software to do that. And the National Library was prepared to host those journals. So in discussing with Bobby over the dining room table, I thought, why don't I just start a journal about adoption? And that's what I did. And in a strange quirk of fate, I found myself at the right place and the right time and moment in history when my adopted country, Australia, was about to explore forced adoption in a very big way.
In the journal, I know so many people who've had articles in there, and you gave a voice to a lot of people, which, at the time, as you said, there wasn't many other vehicles. And that's really incredible that you gave people that opportunity. And the journal was very active, and it saw some incredible adoption events here in Australia. Can you refresh our memories as to some of the events that happened during the time that the journal was active?
Yeah, there was a lot happening. They had a Senate inquiry and a federal inquiry into forced adoption, and they called for submissions, and they had meetings. That inquiry produced a report and with recommendations. And I'd like to certainly thank Senators Rachel Seward and Kim Moore, who ran that. They did an incredible job. And in addition to that, the Australian Institute of Family Studies, they did an investigation into past adoptions, and that informed the Senate inquiry. The Monash University, they were doing a history project on adoption. We then had all these apologies. Every state and only the ACT of the territories, and then we had the national apology as well, and the National Archives of Australia, they did a website on adoption, and they created an exhibition without consent, which toured nationally. And also at that time, it was the beginning of when Facebook took off, and Facebook groups came into vogue, and and that was really one of the first times that adopted people could find their king, and meet up, practically 24/7 if they wanted to. And then also there was the 10th National Adoption Conference. And I think that's the last one they've ever held, back in 2013, which was held in Melbourne. And there I presented a paper, and which I looked at a few days ago, and it still has currency and relevance, because it was titled "Living with Adoption: A Quest for Hope, Healing, and Happiness." And it's still very much what a lot of us as adopted people do. We seek hope and healing and happiness. So it was a very exciting and dynamic period in which to participate with all these things happening. And I jumped in. I got involved on many levels. I made submissions. I attended 3 of the apology events in person. I sat on committees. I met many mothers and fathers and adoptees. And I even opened the Without Consent exhibition when it was hosted in Wagga, where we started as a new migrant in Australia. So, as I said at the beginning, it was, I just happened to be at the right place in the right time with all these extraordinary things happening, which related to something that was so deeply personal, and which, when I was growing up, I couldn't talk about or find, very little information. And people would find that odd because, if you put type adopted person into Google today, I did that a few days ago. I think there's over about 160 million, references. And, that just wasn't there when in the time period that I, grew up. So yes, it was an exciting period, and I'm very thankful that I was part of it and could contribute something, in terms of what AJA was.
What did you learn and take away from your involvement in these events over this period? And I wonder what has stayed with you as being of real importance.
Many things. I mean, it was a privilege and an opportunity to witness and be part of and write about these events, especially people's personal stories. I mean, they taught me so much about, to validate my own experience of loss and disconnection, but also to build, my own life. And I'm sure you might feel the same way when you think about your 60 plus podcasts that you've done for Adopt Perspective. And then, secondly, I mean, our mothers suffered, right? And they also led the fight for decades for recognition and validation and acknowledgement that what they went through in losing their children was cruel. It was unjust. It caused them hurt, harm, and shame, which they didn't deserve. And so personally, reading, listening, speaking to mothers, I finally understood and could reconcile and with that question that niggled me for large periods of my life, why did my mother give me away? How could she? And basically, she had no choice. She was given no choice at the time. And at her most vulnerable, she was steered towards adoption, being told this would be the best for me, although hurtful to her, and not something that she wanted. So, like many mothers, she suffered deeply. And so in talking to other mothers, I could grasp the full magnitude of Dorothea's pain and giving me up, to the system of adoption. And that helped me a lot. It removed a lot of the anger, that I carried for a long time. And another thing as well, that, after all these inquiries, Senate, AIFS, the Monash, I think people were generally surprised that adoptees were not forever happy, trouble-free individuals who lived this perfect and idyllic life in their substitute families. That wasn't part of the script or the fairy tale, when closed adoption was created. I think people were generally surprised that, like our mothers, we wanted and at times demanded acknowledgement, validation about our loss and what we had suffered, and which we could never mourn or grieve. And we wanted, services to deal or offer, to services around finding our information or with in therapy for and I think many people weren't sure how to handle us as we were seen as being forever the adopted child and rescued and silenced. And the system of adoption didn't want to hear we were unhappy and had suffered harm, and they couldn't accept us now as adults with our own experience who wanted to speak. And they wanted us to remain, obedient, compliant, the adopted child that had been rescued. And I think this continues in some areas, because it's always difficult for adopted people to have a meaningful voice at the table when it comes to adoption, because I think people are ever fearful that we will challenge the age-old belief that adoption is a benevolent act that is always beneficial to the child. And it isn't. It isn't harm-free. And we have to remind the system of that fact, even if they don't like it. And just two last points. Adoption, as you will well know, and many other people who are listening would know, is complex. The impacts are profound. They're personal. They're intergenerational. They affect our mothers, our fathers, our siblings, our grandparents, and also the adopted families themselves. And it's complex. And the apologies were important, and we did need to hear the words, we are sorry, and this happened to you, and we will make sure it doesn't happen again. But many people didn't hear those words, they also, and many believe there needs to be more to be done regarding tangible support, with dealing with negative health outcomes or redress. So there's still a lot of hurt and anger out there. And I think, you and I were both at the 10th anniversary of the commemoration of the apology earlier this year. And yes, there was still hurt and anger and agitation. So yes, there's probably still a lot more that needs to be done. And it's not surprising that, the Victorians, they went and did their own, inquiry into adoption after the national inquiry. And I think the Western Australians are doing something similar as we speak. So there's probably a lot more that needs to be done.
The conversation that I had with Thomas was so amazing that we ended up going well over time. So I decided to turn it into 2 episodes instead of 1, so that we didn't have to edit it down or have a podcast that was too long. We didn't want it too long. So I'm going to end things here, and we'll pick up in the next episode to finish the conversation with Thomas Graham. Thanks for listening to the Adopt Perspective podcast. If you'd like to find out more, go to the podcast page on www.jigsawqueensland.com, and you'll find a wealth of information and resources on the website. If you reside in Queensland, you can reach Jigsaw Queensland's Forced Adoption Support Service on toll-free 1800 210313, or you can call Jigsaw on 07 33 58 6666. If you live in another state of Australia, you can still call the Forced Adoption Support Service number, and your call will be answered by the Forced Adoption Support Service in the state that you're calling from. In every other state, Relationships Australia operates this service. A big thank you to Matt Sparrow for composing and recording our original theme music. Until next time, I'm Jo Sparrow saying farewell from Adopt Perspective, a podcast for anyone affected by adoption.